Friends, this morning we are finishing up a series we've been talking through all month long, and we've called this series Living in Exile, thinking through what it means to move from desolation to dependence. One of the most exciting topics we could choose for the month of January, don't you think? Maybe not. Exile is not always one of those topics that fills us with joy and excitement, but then again, maybe that's part of the reason. That we have entered into 2021, leaving this year of 2020 hopefully in our rearview mirror, although it has a tendency to creep its ugly head up every once in a while. But it isn't a matter of what year the calendar says. It isn't a matter of what is going around in our lives all the time. The reality is we do find ourselves in seasons and periods of exile. And as Christ followers, it isn't a matter of how do we avoid those missteps. It is the reality that there are times in which we simply are called into exile. Throughout this series, we've talked about the exile of scarcity and temptation. We've talked about the exile of loneliness. We've talked about the exile of abusive leadership and of waiting. And each week, we've reminded you of what exile is. When we have said that exile is when you have been mentally, physically, and or spiritually misplaced or displaced. And as at times how depressing that can be, the message for the church, the message for God's people is critically important. That these seasons of our lives, as inevitable as they are seasons in which God is doing things in your life. That God is doing things in your heart and calling you into a greater sense of understanding and dependence on who God is. So no matter what type of exile we find ourselves in, the call is to grow and learn and become more of who God is in our lives. This week, we finished the series talking about the exile of urgency. The exile of urgency. Could also be known as the exile of do or die, now or never, with your back against the wall. Right now, in this moment, in this season, you have to act, you have to speak up, you have to do something. The imagery that came to mind when we're talking about the exile of urgency is that 24-second shot clock in basketball. The 24-second. I'm an Indiana Pacers fan, and to be honest, they are so fun to watch this season. I know there's discussions with whether or not we can see them on TV. But if you're able to watch them, they're a fun team to watch this year, to watch them play. And the shot clock continues to be an important part of the NBA basketball game. In fact, it was introduced in the 1950s when the game wasn't as exciting, wasn't as fun. Scores were lower and shots were less common. In fact, the fan base was dwindling for years and years, and they were trying to find a solution that would bring fans back into the fold, that would make the excitement a little bit more engaging for people, for the scores to go higher. And so when they were thinking about how to do this, one of the owners of one of the teams came up with this idea that we could implement a shot clock. And the way they came up with 24 seconds was he was thinking through some of the games that were exciting, that kept his attention, where the scores were high and the fans were engaged. And those games, he kind of went back and reviewed and noticed that each team put up about 60 baskets or 60 shots per game. And so he took that number of 60 and using the number of seconds in an entire game, created an equation that basically broke down the game into 24-second segments, hence the 24-second shot clock. You can imagine introducing this into the league was mixed emotions and reactions from coaches and players and fans alike. In fact, when it first was established and they had this 24-second period, this 24-second shot clock, this you have to put up a shot or you lose your possession, the players, they noticed, ended up taking a shot every 8 to 11 seconds. And when you think about it, it's because they felt the pressure of that 24 seconds. They felt the pressure of the clock on their back, thinking, I have to take a shot or we're going to lose possession. So they ended up taking a shot on average every 8 to 11 seconds into the shot clock. And when we think about urgency, When we think about seasons or moments or situations in our lives in which we must make a decision and we must make a decision now, that's the exile of urgency. That's what we're talking about. When we think through Scripture, there are a lot of examples we could turn to from Genesis to Revelation, but we wanted to highlight the book of Esther. Esther is an interesting book. It's not super long. It's about 10 chapters long and tells the story of how Esther was called by God to save the Jews, to save God's people. You see, Esther was in a time of exile almost herself, with King Xerxes ruling over the land, which included God's people. Esther was a Jew herself. In fact, she was a beautiful young woman. And there was a time in which King Xerxes was looking for a queen, and he saw Esther. And Esther captured his heart. Esther, from a very young age, was raised by her uncle Mordecai. And in this process of Esther being courted and becoming queen of King Xerxes, Mordecai told her not to tell anybody that she was a Jew. Just not to tell anybody, because it would create more problems and difficulties for her down the road. So Xerxes and Queen Esther lived their life. She was in the palace. She had regular conversations with the queen, and she, for the most part, simply knew her place. But the king had a right-hand man named Haman. Haman was less excited about the Jews. In fact, he was insulted by the Jews. Mordecai himself insulted Haman, or at least that's how Haman took it, because Mordecai would not bow down as Haman, the right hand to King Xerxes, when he walked by. And this made Haman angry. So angry that he convinced King Xerxes to sign an edict or a decree that in a few months down the road, all the people were invited or given permission to kill and plunder the Jews. Haman's idea was, let's wipe them all out so we don't have to deal with any of them anymore. He convinced Xerxes to do just that. And when the signed edict came out, Mordecai was, mortified. How are we going to survive? What are we going to do? And yet Mordecai knew Esther had a special place in the palace. That Esther had the king's ear in a way that could influence him. And so he went to Esther. Mordecai said, Esther, you need to go talk to the king. You need to explain what's going on. You need to save our people. But Esther knew that if she were to go in front of the king without being invited, that she herself in that very moment could be put to death, because that's just not something that you did. And so Esther prayed about it and eventually felt the calling of God in her life. And she went before the king, and long story short, the people of the Jews were saved because Esther acted, moved, and responded in this moment of urgency, this exile of urgency, in which she had to figure out some of her own stuff and overcome her own fears and put her own life on the line in this moment. In fact, it is one of the statements that Mordecai makes to Esther that rings most true to me when it comes to the exile of urgency. Mordecai says, "Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this?" Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? And as it turns out, it was exactly the case. As we find ourselves living life in this world, experiencing seasons and circumstances that we may be forced into an exile of urgency, when our backs are against the wall, when it's do or die, now or never, we must reconcile those feelings for ourselves. And so I invite you to think through this question as we wrestle with what it means to be forced into exile of urgency. What do we do when the urgency of our circumstance collides with the uncertainty of our responsibility? What do we do when the urgency of our circumstance collides with the uncertainty of our responsibility? When what's going on around us calls us into action forces us into a position that we're not exactly sure what to do or how to do it. What is God asking us to do? What role can we possibly play? What does it mean to be God's in those moments, those exiles of urgency when it is now or never, do or die, our backs are against the wall, the world and others have put us on a shot clock? How do we live into it without knowing exactly how God is calling us to respond? Esther teaches us several lessons, and I kind of want to walk us through her experience because I believe we can learn a lot from Queen Esther, a woman who led her people to safety, who put herself on the line when the shot clock was coming down, and she was revered and celebrated for generations and generations and generations. What we need to realize as we find ourselves in the exile of urgency is that we must pause to pray. That we must pause to pray. Understand there's purpose and reason in that statement. It isn't simply pause to do nothing. It is pause to pray. And it isn't simply pray as you go. It is to actually take a moment, a pause in your life to connect with God. That's exactly what Esther did. As she was discerning Mordecai's call upon her to step in and speak to King Xerxes, she invited others to join her, and she fasted for 3 days. She fasted for 3 days. Fasting is a discipline in the Christian faith, even yet today, where we would set aside food, where we would simply use water and kind of focus our energy and focus our thoughts into who God is asking us to be and using that time to pray. If you'd like more information on fasting, it really is an opportunity to say, I'm going to give something up so that I may be more in tune to the work of the Spirit in my life. As with every other part of this series, we have included resources on our website that you can go to right now. For this message, you have a link that explains fasting. You also have a link to a more recent movie of the Book of Esther. If you'd like to dive deeper down into her story, that's there as well. But make no mistake, all the resources we've put on there are applicable to any of the exiles that we experience. But in Esther's case, in this moment, she fasted for 3 days as she was trying to tune in to God's Spirit to figure out what she was to do. You see, no matter how urgent the matter is, there is always time to connect to God. There is always time to pray. There is always time to stop. Whether you have 5 seconds, 5 days, or 5 months, and your urgency is coming down upon you, we can't simply act without connecting to our Creator God. For if we are put in a position just for this particular time, then we have been put there for purpose and reason by our Creator. And if we aren't checking in with Him and connecting with Him, then how will we know exactly what we are to do, what we're supposed to say, how we're supposed to respond in any given moment, no matter how much time is left on the clock? And so we are invited to pause to pray. Just like Esther found the time to fast, even as time was closing in on her people. We also must we must pray to plan. We must pray to plan and realize that the purpose of our prayer is to plan what's next. The purpose of our prayer and the purpose to connect with God is to understand how He's inviting us to live into His call. With Esther, what she did is she was very intentional about how she approached the king. She didn't simply go and say, hey, king, you need to take care of this problem. If you love me, you'll fix this. Esther knew how the palace worked. Now, she first had to kind of go in front of the king unannounced, which in that moment or in that time, she could have been killed for. If the king did not welcome her and she came in without being invited, it could have ended very badly for Esther. So happens that the king welcomed her without ever being invited. Now, Esther in that moment could have taken advantage of the situation and said, King, you need to fix this and make this right, but she didn't. When the king welcomed her, he said, what do you need, Esther? I'll give you anything you need, even if it is half of my kingdom. But Esther knew. Esther knew that this wasn't the moment. She said, King, I prepared a banquet for you. And she even invited Haman, his right-hand man, who was setting out to kill all the Jews. I've created this banquet. Would you and Haman join me this afternoon? And the king obliged. They got to the banquet, and again the king says, Esther, what can I do for you? What do you want? Even if it is half of my kingdom, I will give it to you. And Esther said, I want you to join me at a banquet tomorrow. And she invited Haman to join them. And it was at that banquet that Esther began to share with the king her heart and what was going on. Because she prayed to plan her approach to the king. She prayed to plan, and as we understand that, the truth is that we connect with God in order to discern and align our next steps with God's desire. We must understand that we first have to listen to God to know exactly what He's asking us to do. In those seasons and those exiles of urgency, we must align our will and our steps with God's desire so that we may more fully live into who He's calling us to be. That's exactly what Esther did in this situation. God invited her to pause so that she could pray, and to pray so that she could plan based on everything that was going on around her. The interesting thing was, though, God was working in ways that she couldn't possibly see. God was kind of helping massage things and making circumstances take place to prepare the king, to put Haman in difficult situations, to rise up Mordecai and other people around them, so that while Esther was patiently working, even with a time frame, God was doing what God does. We have to understand that even when we are in the midst of a season of urgency, God is doing things around us. And as we pray to plan, we have to make sure those plans and those next steps are aligned with God's will and His desire in our life. What happened next was a call to plan, to persevere. Now, Esther saved her people. And she convinced the king to create another edict that would allow the people of God to protect themselves or defend themselves against all of those who were trying to attack them. And so there was kind of this dual edict going on at the same time. But nonetheless, the desire was to help her people, or more specifically, to make sure God's kingdom persevered in the midst of a situation and a circumstance that was going on around them. God has done that time and time and time and time again, and very likely He has done that in your life in one way or another. What we have to understand about what it means to persevere or to plan to persevere is it isn't about Esther making sure that she survives the situation. No, because it was a very real thing that Esther, in that moment when she first approached the king, would have died. She knew that going into it. And she knew that if the king needed to kill her, that was what it was going to be, because she wasn't trying to persevere or preserve herself or persevere for her own benefit. She was trying to help God's kingdom and God's people persevere through the difficult season they find themselves in. That season of urgency, although Esther was put in a place to act, it wasn't about surviving. It was about responding to God's call in our life. Friends, in our lives, we realize that our next steps in this process or in these seasons or exiles of urgency, that our next steps should outline the path we walk to help usher in God's kingdom on earth. Not about us. It's not about our glory. It's not about making sure we get recognition or even that we survive. It's about putting ourselves in a position to understand who God is, what He wants to see happen, and what our role is in that, so that God's plan and His kingdom and all that He desires may be experienced in the world around us. So when we are put in a position of urgency, of do or die or now or never, when our backs are up against the wall, know that it is not always about us overcoming. It's about us persevering for the sake of God's kingdom on earth. And Esther, because of that focus, saved her people. And then we finish her story by realizing that she persevered to praise. Or, in a grander sense, she persevered so that God's people could praise. Esther's people remembered what she did, how she did it, and why she did it. In fact, an entire festival and feast is designed around this moment of Esther stepping into this exile of urgency and being willing to speak up and act in those moments, that time, that moment of need. She was willing to do that. And God's people praised, not Esther, but the fact that God's plan was lived out. Esther was simply a part of that process. Because when the fruition of God's kingdom is experienced, we are to bear witness to his glory and celebrate. When God set the stage and worked behind the scenes, when Esther lived into her call in that exile of urgency, when everything happened that needed to happen, God's people were still alive. And in a very real sense, we gather today because God's people are still alive. And we bear witness to his glory, and we celebrate his works, even those that happen behind the scenes that we don't know about or only recognize after the fact. It is our responsibility to praise as God's kingdom on earth and his desire and his goals continue to persevere and preserve what we experience in this world. For our role is about living into God's call, even when our backs are against the wall. And so we celebrate God. We bear witness to his glory all around us, knowing that he is there. And so we move through this process of what it means to pray, to plan and persevere and praise and do all of the things that he is calling us to do. I'm reminded of the scripture in Proverbs, that book of wisdom that continues to give us direction and hope. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take." Even in the exile of urgency. Even when you feel the pressure of time and circumstance and people around you. We have God directing and leading us. And so we don't have to feel like we're on our own. We don't have to feel like we have to figure it all out, for God is here in our midst. And maybe, just maybe, we are invited to respond just the way Esther did to Mordecai's proclamation. When he told her, "Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for such a time as this?" Maybe in your life, right now, in this moment, you can hear Mordecai speak into your spirit. Who knows if perhaps you were fill in the blank for just such a time as this? Who knows if you have endured heartache for just such a time as this? Who knows if you were put in this place for just such a time as this? Who knows if you have this job, if you've lost this job, or if you're searching for a job for just such a time as this? Who knows if the door's been opened for just such a time as this? For this moment could matter. Just like Esther's moment mattered to the continuation of God's people, this moment matters or could matter for something grander and greater than either you or I could possibly understand. No pressure, right? I get that we like to recognize it is the whole of our life that God looks at, and I don't discount that. Every single day we are called to respond and be who God calls us to be, but I do believe, just in Esther's situation, there are those moments, those situations, those exiles of urgency in which we are called and pushed to move in a very specific way. So we cannot discount the moment that we have in front of us. Maybe it was a moment that you simply were at the right place at the right time. I have no doubt you've had those. I've had them. At the grocery store, standing in line, something going on in front of you that you just don't feel right about. You just don't know if everybody is safe. And yet we look around and at times we don't say a word, even though we have felt that Spirit nudge us. There may be a time in which you have spoke out, in which you have done something, in which you have said or spoken or called and acted. Maybe you have felt that perhaps you were in that position for just such a time as this. I think we've had both sides of that equation in our lives a variety of times. And when we're in that place, that exile of urgency, that back against the wall, do or die, now or never moment, we feel emotionally connected, right? Our anxiety rises. We begin to worry. We have fear that kind of wells up inside of us. Sometimes we are physically ill because we just don't know what to do or when to do it or how to do it. And that's when we rely back on Esther's story. And we remember the process that she can teach us through her story in those exiles or those moments of urgency. Who knows if perhaps you were fill in that blank for yourself. What is it right now? What does it have? What has it been? And what are you open to it being in the future? Who knows if perhaps you were for just such a time as this? See, we, in some sense, have that shot clock on our life. Sometimes it's the whole and sometimes it's the moment. But let's be honest, there is this sense of urgency in what it means to be God's people. When that shot clock was introduced, and I told you they didn't quite know how to respond. In fact, shots were put up so quickly that it skewed all of the data and all of the responses that they were experiencing. 8 to 11 second shots would go up because teams were so focused on putting up a shot, doing something, getting something towards the basket that they didn't have time for anything else. They were forced into this circumstance of urgency. But as time went on, they realized that 24 seconds was enough time to develop, to create plays, to make sure they didn't have to settle for a shot, but they could work toward the best shot. And no matter how urgent or dire your situation may be at any given moment or season of your life, realize that you have time to be and do exactly what God is asking you to do. Take a page from the Book of Esther. Pause. Pause to pray. Pray to plan. Plan to persevere. And persevere to praise. Bear witness to how God is using you, even in the most uncomfortable, defined, scary moments where we have to act, and we have to act now. Because God just may have placed you there for just such a time as this. But let's pray together. Father, I give you thanks for the opportunity to be your people. I give you thanks for moments in which we aren't in a season of urgency, and we feel like we have time to breathe, to think, and to pray. But God, when you have led us into those exiles of urgency in which we must act, I pray that we may have the fruition and the understanding to act according to your will, to be used by your Spirit, to be equipped so that we may help your kingdom be seen and experienced by those around us. Let us not discount the role we may play in any given circumstance or in any given moment, no matter how much time we perceive there to be. For we are reminded that you are here amongst us. We are reminded that not only you are here, but the armies of angels that accompany you are with us, carrying us and calling us and working with us, even in ways that we cannot see. Let us not shirk away from those moments of urgency, those times in which it's now or never, do or die with the shot clock running down, but let us step into your call, to use the gifts and all that you have provided us so that this is the time we may help others experience your kingdom, see your works, and be transformed in their lives through the power and love of Jesus Christ. May we be yours and be used by you for the greater good of your kingdom and for the transformation of your people. For it is in the name of Jesus Christ we pray. Amen.